Hello, guys. Welcome to Investing with JYK, and today we'll talk about more about COVID-19 a bit more. It used to be called the coronavirus. Now they have a name, but we'll use the name interchangeably. So this website, COVID19info.live, which has a pretty good info as far as I can tell. So you might find this website useful. It used to be called wooflu.info or something. I don't remember. But one thing to let's just dive into the graphs a bit. So this is a thing to watch for. This is logarithmic scale. So if you have a straight line here, you're essentially at the exponential phase of a spread. And if you flatten out, then your disease is getting under control. So if you look at mainland China, it was straight line-ish for up until probably February the 6th or something, and now it's kind of flatlining in logarithmic scale. Remember, the absolute increase is still fairly high. So if you look at the number here in on the 12th of February, it was under 60,000, and now it's like 77,000. So this is logarithmic scale. If you turn off logarithmic scale, then this is how it looks like. But this kind of misleading. Looks like the rest of the world is flatlining, but that's not the case. You can see it is just essentially the same curve moved over, like time overlapped, but shifted by like probably 2 weeks from these two lines are mixing. I suppose number down here, which is quite drastically underreported. Yeah, it will probably the shape probably look like something like this. So I would say it's fair to say the virus is entering a exponential phase in the rest of the world, while under control, or somewhat under control in China. And obviously, there's a risk for cases going back to China from rest of the world once the rest of the world has enough concentration of infected population. But that would be probably a few months out, like 1 or 2 months out. This disease spreads very fast. So to understand the danger of a particular virus, for me, I think it is. Remember, I'm not an expert on any of this, right? This is just personal opinion. I would say first one I have to look at R naught, which is the average case of secondary infection. So if you get infected, how many people on average do you infect before you either die or heal? And that determines how infectious this particular disease is. So we have some numbers in here. The R naught. Where do we have the R naught? This is, you can see from the URL here, it's from WHO, World Health Organization. Let's see. It's interesting. Huh. Well, in any case, we don't have a solid R naught because it's very hard to pin down. But you have sorry, where was that? Why is this broken? Right here. There's some studies which is done on the 17th of February, so fairly new. They are estimating the R naught to between 3.25 to 3.4. So that is their result. I'm not saying this is the correct number, but that's the estimate. As a comparison, the common influenza the seasonal flu, the seasonal flu, you get to about 1.3 in terms of R naught, and this thing's 3.3, let's say. It may sound like like a difference of 3x-ish, less than 3x, but in reality it's quite worse than that, because this is, if you look at an exponential function, this is the base, right? So if you do 1.3 to the power of 10, you end up with 13. So that means after 10 hops, 13 people will get infected, which is quite a bit. It's about 10 times that, but if you do 20, then you have like 200 of infected. So it's bad, but not too bad. But if you have a 3.3 to the power of 10 by the time of 10 hops, which means like 10 infected cases later on down the chain, you're at 153 infected. And if you give it 20 hops, then you're looking at some ridiculous number, which is basically the population of the Earth, or a bit more. So that is without any control. That's R0. There's also another number called RE, which is affected by disease control, quarantines, behavioral changes, for example, mask wearing, limiting gatherings, and all that stuff that would reduce the RE. Once RE goes down to below 1, then the disease enters a self-eliminating phase, and you get fewer and fewer infected every day. Okay. So this thing, well, the other number that I can give you is, well, the two numbers to compare with is measles, which has an R0 of something like 10 plus, which means it's like super infectious. You touch somebody and everybody gets infected. Imagine that. And the other number is SARS, which in 2003 there was a huge scare and ended up infecting like 8,000 people over the world and killing quite a few, like 400 of them or something like that. Then these guys, that thing has an R0 of about 3. So this is more infectious than SARS, but at the moment it is looking like, with the data we have, it is looking like it's the death rate, the case mortality rate, because there are a couple of definitions here. The case mortality rate is lower than SARS, but that's just what we see now at the point in time. But the thing is, you can't look at death rate like at a particular point in time. You have to. The reason being, the people that die today are not diagnosed today. They're diagnosed like 10 days ago or something like that. So like you get diagnosed with this disease, and maybe 10 days or 7 days or 14 days later you die, if you were to die, right? So you have to like shift the numbers a bit. So if you look at China, currently the death, well, let's just look at death. This is when they change the standard of diagnosis. So let's see, if you're at 10th of February, then the death is 1,000 in China. And if we go back 7 days, let's imagine like you die 7 days after you get diagnosed. Go back 7 days, you're looking at this number. So the confirmed is like 20,000-ish. And then the death at that time is 10,000, well, 1,000. So you're looking at 5% death rate there. Similarly, the recovered rate, I mean, the other way of looking at it is if you look at, number of death, well, death count plus recovered count is clearly not equal to confirmed count. So within those people that haven't recovered and haven't died, some will recover and some will die. So the ratio may be somewhat reliable, given a large enough sample size, but you cannot say that 3.2 is the case mortality rate of this disease. It's going to be higher. And yeah, so that's one thing. And then the other thing that obviously affects the speed of spread for this disease is what's known as a serial interval. So there is this serial interval. So the serial interval, according to WHO, is the time between symptoms onset of primary and secondary cases, which means if you show symptom of COVID-19 and you have in fact infected someone else, how many days later will that someone else show symptom? Okay, and then here we have it. So here's the interesting part. The zero interval range is from 4.2 to 7.5 days. So let's say, for simplicity, let's say 6 days. So that means the disease actually hops every 6 days. So that gives you 5 to 6 days. Let's say 5. Let's say 6 to be on the optimistic side, right? Let's say 6 days. So that means in 6 days you would have infected without any control, without any change in behavior, any control. Then you would have infected R naught number of people 6 days later. Right? So that's the thing to keep in mind. So within a month, that would be 5 hops later, you had 3.3 to the power of 5, you would have infected total 400 people in a month without any control, a single person. Right? So that's how dangerous this disease is. The other thing is, if you look at the incubation period, is 5 to 6 days typically, ranging from 0 to 14 days, but the zero interval is 4.4 to 7.5 days. So that just means things are not adding up. That means within that incubation period, on which you don't show symptom, and I don't remember the exact definition, but it could be that incubation is when you're not transmissive. Like when you become transmissive, it could be several days where you don't show symptoms. There's some people have discovered they're asymptomatic carriers of this virus, and that virus can be detected from their mucus or whatever thing they have in their lungs. At the same time, they don't show any symptoms, and so that's somewhat dangerous part of it, and this would have some serious implications later. And the other thing to keep in mind is that after, well, that we'll talk about later. So okay, so that's these definitions. And then the other thing to watch out for is, if you look at China, right, it doesn't look too bad. You have a 3.2% death rate, which is 30 times or 50 times the flu, even when you don't count in the time lag factor, right? And but if you look at the okay, so let's look at this. When you're in Hubei, which is where the disease came from, your death rate is 3.7, and then with 64,000 infections. And if you look at Jiangsu, which is to the east of China, which with a much better medical system, quite a bit richer and all that stuff, 600 cases. Zhejiang, 1,200 cases. They have very, very low death rate. And then you cannot argue that this is because of the time lag, that these people just caught the disease later, because it's not the case. If you look at the recovered percentage, is much higher now, 60%, 70%. These three, well, Shanghai, Jiangsu, and Zhejiang in China is commonly known as the postage included state. It's a funny term. Basically, like, if you live in these three provinces or cities, in case of Shanghai, you typically don't pay postage when you buy from Jingdong or Taobao, because this is where all the UPS and FedEx equivalent is based in China, and then they have the cheapest postage and the best logistic framework infrastructure. Sorry, right? But very high recovered rate, very low death rate. That means the death rate is actually very low. And if you look at the Hubei, well, recovered rate is very low, death rate is very low, well, very high compared to the other three we just saw. That means both has a chance of climbing. Right? So imagine if your recovery rate would go up 3x, well, your death rate might go up 3x as well if nothing changes. Obviously, if you find a better treatment or have some improvement, then your recovery rate would increase at a faster rate than the death rate. But otherwise, it is not unperceivable to have the death rate to go up another 2 to 3x, and at which point you end up with like a 10% death rate. So why is there such a difference, right? You have places where you have 0 death for 1,000 people, and here you have 2,000 deaths for 64,000 people. Well, the thing that I think is the reason is that we don't have a cure for this disease, and the only thing that we have are some experimental treatments like the plasma infusion from a previously cured, previously recovered patient. That's one thing that seems to be effective, and hopefully it can be the cure, but there's no double-blind test yet. And there are some antiviral drugs that you might have heard of, like Gilead has produced something that used to be targeting AIDS and seems to be effective in this case. And maybe we can try some hormone, well, not hormone, what do you call it? Steroids and stuff like that. And then, you may be able to do something. But the main thing that we are sure to help at the moment is just life support. Right? If you have difficulty breathing, we give you a breathing machine. If you have trouble, if your lung has trouble taking oxygen, we'll give you high concentration oxygen. And the last resort would be an ECMO machine, where you essentially have an external lung while your lung recovers before. So hopefully your lung will recover in the time that, and while your lung is recovering, you have something to supply your body with oxygen. But these ECMO machines are very expensive. Their supply is inelastic in the sense that I can pay, the price can go up 10x, right? And then each ECMO machine can go from 500,000 yuan or like $50,000. Maybe do a 10x, you have a $500,000 per machine. The supply of that machine won't go up quickly enough. So yeah, we're in this modern society, we're very good at taking good care of a limited number of people, but when a significant proportion of your population catches this disease, you just don't have enough resources in that limited amount of time. Obviously, if give like 3 years or something like that, yeah, I'm sure we're able to produce mass amounts of ECMO. We're able to train huge number of people to be able to operate those machines, and we can even convert a lot of doctors from not being able to operate on people to stick these machines in, like intubate people to be able to do that. Right? So these are the cases. Like in the short term, being month, you won't have a huge supply of these ultimate life support system for these lung infected. Okay, so yeah, so that's that. So like, let's say like in this case, what you as a individual, what you can hope is you're at somewhere where you have plenty of spare medical capacity, where if you do need additional life support, you can get it. And that is seems to be the determining factor here when it comes to death rate, right? And yeah, so that's the thing I want to say. And then yeah, so the other hope we can have for stopping the spread are essentially two things. We can either have a vaccine, very similar to like the seasonal flu. We can have a vaccine, or we can have just quarantine the whole thing to like just lock down like SARS. You quarantine people, and hopefully you catch every single case, and it just stops the spread. You turn our E to something like ridiculously low, to like 0.1, and give it a couple of hops, it just dies out. Now, vaccines are fantastic if it worked, but here is a case. I found this paper that basically said immunization with SARS-CoV coronavirus vaccine leads to pulmonary immunopathology on challenge with the SARS virus. All right, so what it's saying is that if you gave what they use? They use some kind of animal, and then they produce a bunch of vaccines, and they injected into the animals and then infected them with SARS. Well, it turns out the animals did have a good response to SARS, which is what you expect from a vaccine. There's a bunch of antibody produced. But at the same time, this is all induced antibody and protection against infection with SARS-CoV. So this is what the conclusion was. So these vaccines are effective. Good news. However, well, the mice given any vaccine had this Th2 type. I don't know what that means. Immunopathology. So that basically means your immune system now gets bonkers and start attacking yourself. And that just means you might, yes, the vaccine is effective, but it may be a bit too effective, and then your body goes crazy and starts attacking itself. So you might have a higher death rate than if you haven't had the vaccine, which kind of defeats the purpose. So you can't have the vaccine because if you had it, you would die of your own immune system instead of the virus, which is like how much better is it than to die at the hands of SARS if they had hands. So in this case, this is on SARS. Why am I talking about SARS when this is concerning COVID-19? Because these are very similar viruses and they have very similar shapes, and it may be very likely be the case that it would have a similar humans might have a similar reaction to COVID-19 vaccines, just like this case. And it's not a new phenomenon. I have this page open. The reason, like dengue fever, not sure if I pronounce it correctly. Essentially, if you get it the second time where you have the antibodies, so when you have supposedly been almost like vaccinated, except it's like kind of worse, you have a higher chance of dying. Right? This is not a new phenomenon. Certain viruses, certain combination of virus and human immune system means that the second occasion of infection kills you even faster. So that could be the case here. So quarantine doesn't quite work because of the asymptomatic transmission that I talked about in the previous discussion. It was the the zero interval. Right, so if you do have asymptomatic transmission, then how do you catch people? You can't screen, well, you could screen people every single day with these test kits, and then you have to be able to get it, because a lot of times they have false positives, not because these kits are bad, because they don't have the virus when they are just normally coughing, right? If you do a deep cough and versus if you do a normal cough, these are two. If you just do a swab, these are different things. It is entirely likely where the virus is at the lower part of your lung, and at the top part of your respiratory tract, you don't have any virus, right? So how do you educate the entire population to be able to use these kits effectively? We don't know. So quarantine doesn't quite work. Vaccine has its own dangers, and then the last thing, which is temperature, could be a case here. Could be useful. So in 2003, or I think 3, SARS kind of just vanished into May. So nobody quite know why that happened. It is either we did a fantastic job on controlling the spread, or, as a lot of people suspected, it could be the temperature that killed the virus. Maybe the virus is not, it kind of loses its transmissiveness, its infectiousness in temperatures above a certain threshold. And as the entire northern hemisphere enters into summer in May of 2003, the disease kind of just went down. It's R naught. You can think of it as R naught goes down, the temperature goes up. Right, so once the R naught goes below 1, then it's self-eliminating. So that could be a hope. At the moment, we're in February, and northern hemisphere is still fairly cold, but we do have southern hemisphere infections. Right, so you have and equatorial areas where you have tropical areas, you have infections. So Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, these are good canaries in the mine, in a sense. If in a hot temperature, yeah, if they have like imported cases, if this disease does not become endemic to that region while it is hot, then it is possible, it is probable even, to expect this disease to become self-eliminating in the northern hemisphere once the temperature goes somewhere. Once the temperature in the northern hemisphere goes above, let's say, 25 or 30 degrees Celsius even. So that we have to watch for. At the moment, we do not have confirmed community transmission, like endemic. We don't have signs of this disease become endemic to countries that are in tropical regions yet. And if we don't have that for another month, then I think we're in luck. Okay, so that's just on the disease. And then we'll talk about some weird stuff in China, especially in Wuhan. And then some of you may already want to say, oh, but these numbers from China, these are all fake numbers. We cannot trust them. Yeah, of course, nobody trusts them. Even people in China don't trust them. Don't think that Chinese are all dumb because they're all brainwashed and all that. No, people know these numbers are fake. They're underreported, either on purpose or not. We have no evidence. It is not unreasonable to assume there's some it is on purpose skewed, right? So yeah, we know it's underreported. So maybe the death is much higher, the confirmed case is much higher, which makes this number very fuzzy. You can't trust the number there. And then there's some other things that I want to say is there's website in China called Dingxiangyuan, which is a bunch of doctors and getting together and trying to spread knowledge on healthcare related issues. Unfortunately, or fortunately, these doctors are somewhat of moral beings, which can be a bad thing in China. Yeah, it's saying that at the front line of this anti-epidemic campaign, I'm translating approximately, we are helping patients under the condition of political correctness. Well, what does that actually mean? So what they're saying is, well, the numbers are driving the people, not the numbers are driving facts, not facts driving numbers. So they're saying in order to increase the turnover of beds, there are three conditions. So they become better, and the opacity in their lungs are disappearing, and they are tested twice to be negative when they use these kits for RNA detection. So what happens is, according to him, and this is supposed to have come from a well, this is probably gone. Yeah, it's deleted. Obviously, guess what? The original post is deleted on the forum from Dingxiang. I mean, it doesn't surprise me at all. So it's saying that some patients were still oxygenated. Well, they're intubated. Actually, not intubated. They were just still given oxygen and and can't walk. And then the next moment they're discharged because they have met these three conditions, and then their RNA detection positive rate is less than 30%. Essentially saying there's a high chance of these people getting discharged, which would go under this recovered number, are still infected, and then they were discharged, and then they have to go back home on their own to under quarantine. Well, yeah, maybe you go home and then you become infectious and give it to others. Remember, well, I actually haven't talked about it. So for a lot of these diseases, these infectious diseases, even after the disappearance of your symptoms, you are still infectious for another number of days. For example, flu, you're actually still infectious for another like 7 days ish after you become well. Right? You would infect someone else, even though you don't feel under the influence of flu. After maybe 7 to 10 days, and then they have to for some reason they give them Chinese medicine, which is personally I'm against Chinese medicine, not that because it's Chinese, but because it's just not the way this thing is developed is not scientific, right? A lot of the Chinese medicine, what you call them, recipes, they might be effective, but you have to test them to establish their effectiveness. The moment we don't have that, and then they just give them some recipe, and a lot of them are poisonous, and they're saying that if you don't give them these Chinese medicines, then you get punished for it, and then people would develop they're saying that their liver gets damaged potentially during the period of hospitalization because of these poisonous Chinese medicines. And 3 is they have to lie just to increase the number of discharged, even though some people don't have their CT, the CAT scan, it still hasn't shown improvement. You have to say they have significantly improved, just because you have to discharge them. And yeah, so he's saying that some of these discharged have a worse symptom than the people that are being taken in. Okay, so yeah, it's saying this is similar to Great Leap Forward. So, well, Wuhan, at least it's locked down, so nobody actually gets in or out of Wuhan, except maybe some food and stuff. Even that is getting more scarce, and the price is shooting up. But what's going to happen is probably the entire population would be in Wuhan, at least for now, will be the disease would go through the entire population, and whoever survives, whoever dies, dies. But that seems to be the case in Wuhan, and whatever. There's nothing you can do, nothing we can do. It's just an interesting case. Okay. Now on to economic. Oh yeah, two more other things I wanted to show you. Anecdotes about how infectious the disease is. 15 seconds at the same stall when they're at a food market. 15 seconds, that's enough to get them infected. This thing had a 50-second infection, so both of them were at a hospital picking up prescribed drugs, and they were there for 50 seconds, according to cameras, I suppose. And yeah, they get infected. And then this woman were queuing up and buying roasted duck. Wow, how very specific. 7 days later, gets diagnosed with this disease, and the only known case of contact was with this guy at the queue to buy roasted duck. So, moral of the story: don't buy roasted duck. No, buy roasted duck. They're delicious. I love them. On to consumption. Well, what's gonna get affected? There's no slides, no web page to accompany it. What I think is anything that requires a fixed position for a lot of people to gather in order to consume that service is gonna get affected. Malls and certain retail, like clothing and stuff, and what else is there? Restaurants, obviously, and then other kinds of, well, air transportation. Obviously, you don't want to, and in fact, any kind of mass transport, because the last thing you want is get stuck in a place with 100 other people or 50 other people for extended period of time, and so that is all going to get affected. The other thing is you're going to get supply disruption. So why that? The global supply chain now is very deeply embedded in, well, China is very deeply embedded into the global supply chain, and a lot of these companies have adopted what's known as just-in-time supply chain. Essentially, they store their parts for hours instead of, well, some even tens of minutes instead of months. So their inventory, especially the raw material, is takes much lower takes very little of their own capital. It's a very efficient way of running their business, except when you get into supply chain disruption, which means that you end up with, like, if any of your supply chain gets disrupted, you are disrupted. You stop. You cannot function. If you study the, or if you read the book, oh, I actually got it from the book from Jim Rogers, right, where he went to Russia and he saw these piles and piles of inventory in Russian factories, and then they asked him why, because they can't get it reliably. So it's like a defense mechanism when you stock up on, if you have to constantly carry a large inventory, which is like going the other direction, which is very unhealthy, right? Very, very low efficiency. Your inventory might get degraded and rust and all that. But in the current era, we're going the other direction. So that's supply chain disruption because China gets affected. Within China, there are, well, obviously you can get disrupted when you don't have enough workers. So let's see. I talked to a couple of business owners. Right, so this guy said the factory in Ningbo hasn't even opened up. This is 22nd of February already. Normally, this is almost 1 month later. The whole thing was supposed to start back up by the 31st of January, and they still haven't started. Right, so this is their factory. And then this is another factory from another owner. They produce these LEDs. Right, so they have started on the 13th, but only half of the machines are working because they don't have enough people. The people are slowly rolling in. Right, so that's that. And this is close to, well, if you look at the map, this is here in this province, which isn't exactly, considered as top tier, but it's not too bad. It's reasonably wealthy. And so, yeah, even there, you have like a 50%. This is obviously anecdotal, but 50%. Well, imagine if you're in Hubei. You are screwed. Right, and then if you look at, I also asked this guy, he also owns a few factories in China. He said his Zhejiang factory, which is this province here, has opened on the, well, I suppose this is lunar calendar, so that's quite early. That's like beginning of February. So he's got his guys working for all that time, and he also has a factory in Guangdong, which is, if you remember in the video about GSH, this is also another economic engine of China, and that thing is, according to him, has started last week, which is about 2 weeks later than it was supposed to be. But it has opened, so and fully, so that's fully recovered. So I suppose within Guangdong, and Zhejiang, the situation, well, Ningbo, this guy here. This guy here is from Ningbo. Is also from this part. So I would say maybe a little bit more, 50%, more than 50% operational in these areas. So yeah, so you can't get workers. Okay, so that's the supply disruption. Long term, I would say, if it had an impact, long term, what I'm saying is like for a few years later, the China as the world's factory might get challenged. Like, people may not want such high concentration of their supply chain to depend on China. And also, just-in-time inventory management may also get challenged as a doctrine. Maybe they will now, people would lean a bit backwards towards safety rather than efficiency. And very interestingly, all of the factory owners that I talked to, they all had at least a month of supply of parts stocked up before the end of last Chinese lunar year. And I would say that's very lucky for them because it's just a standard operating procedure for these factories, because everybody know there's always supply disruption at the beginning of the lunar year because people these migrant workers will go back home and stay a few more days. They just don't want to come back and stuff like that. Okay. Yeah, and the last part would be on comparison with the 1918 flu. So 1918 flu killed about 50 million people, give or take. Back then, obviously, we don't know how to test for it. We don't have the modern life support system. So if you were to die, you kind of die. There's no antiviral drug, as far as I know. So it's the worst condition. At the moment, actually, the only thing that got kind of better is, well, two things got better. We know how to test-ish. We know, so diagnosis got better. We know how to quarantine. Well, back in 1918, we know how to quarantine too, because the word quarantine came from the Italians from like the Roman times, I think. And the thing that we do best is ICUs. Essentially, we are very good at giving the critically ill the support they need in order for their own body to recover. But there are limits to that, as I talked before. We have a limited number of ICUs. We have a limited number of ICU nurses, ICU doctors, and these things are not elastic. You don't just produce ICU nurses like you produce cars, and it's basically the same saying. It doesn't matter how many women you give me. It takes 9 months to make a baby. And so back then, what was the impact of stock market? According to this Seeking Alpha article, well, the second wave, which was the deadliest, caused about 11%. Well, corresponds to 11% drop. We don't know if it caused it, but it is very likely, I think. And so that's that. And you would say, oh, but we have the Fed. They didn't. Well, they did. There's a book called, where the hell is my book? Damn it. Anatomy of the Bear. And then it was 1917 Fed. And then they had Fed money. Oh, here we go. Here. Federal Reserve was set up after 1907's bear market, where it was saved essentially by J.P. Morgan. And in, I think, 13 or something, they set up Federal Reserve, and then Federal Reserve had elastic currency. So even when gold supply remained the same, Fed was supplying more money to the market. So yes, Fed was injecting liquidity, as it was the case now. And the proportion of their money, remember back then, I think it wasn't that the Fed was the only supplier of currency. Any bank which had enough gold could produce their own currency. They have produced, well, at least double the at least about their money supply. So there was a liquidity injection even back in 1918. So it is reasonable to expect the market to also go down now. And remember, back then we didn't have this, fast transmission of disease. We did not have this, I would argue, a bit more fragile supply chain, global supply chain. So yeah. And if you look at SPY, you would see that there is no discount of this virus. I mean, this was like, you can't actually see any signs of the market expecting a global disruption from this virus. And I think that's totally wrong. I think, yeah, it should drop a bit, quite a bit, maybe 10%, maybe a bit more, just because of this. And long term, it would be bullish for certain Chinese manufacturers where, well, the reason is a lot of the Chinese manufacturing was done by these small enterprises. These are very inefficiently managed. They barely make money. They scrape by, and they have a shit ton of debt, very expensive debt. And a lot of them is going bankrupt because of this. Well, imagine for any business, if your costs remained about the same while your revenue goes to about zero, how would you fare? That's the case for these small manufacturers. And yeah, so once these die, whoever was making what they were making could make quite a bit of money if they manage to survive. So for that, you need cash on hand and maybe some credit lines, all of which publicly traded companies are, well, they excel at compared to their poorer siblings. Midterm, I'm looking at this Airports of Thailand company. Very interesting. Thailand, 17% of their, well, according to Thailand, 20% of their GDP is from tourism. And they wanted to go to 30%. I think that's completely ridiculous. But that's what they want. Or tourism, Thailand. How do you get to Thailand? Well, by plane. You're not going to travel by car to Thailand from wherever you're from, unless you're from Thailand itself. Right, so it's already showing up as I've seen some reports about Thailand tourist resorts being empty due to the lack of Chinese tourists. Well, no wonder, because people are being locked down, and even if they were not, the Chinese don't want to get into a plane. And Airports of Thailand has basically all the airports in Thailand. And if the Chinese don't go, and if others don't go, well, I would assume this will drop quite a bit, but it hasn't. If you look at the recent price performance, I don't see any indication. Well, I see some indication, since here, this is when the news got released that China had a coronavirus problem, 23rd. It's when Wuhan got locked down and went down a bit, and it recovered quite a bit, and it went down to 65. Well, it's only a 10% drop, so I would say, what if this drops 50%? If this dropped to like 50%, even 30%, you might have a good opportunity at hand. Yeah, this disease might rage on for another year, but as long as Airport of Thailand doesn't go bankrupt, well, the Chinese will go back to Thailand because it's cheap and fun. According to whoever has gone there. I haven't been there. I wanted to go there. So yeah, so I will watch this company. Maybe there are other opportunities because of this virus. And there is a short-term opportunity which none of you can take advantage of. There you go. Where we go? So this factory owner has spare space, and he basically just built his own mask factory with some investment from someone else's, and he just supplied some. He supplied a bit of money and space, and he rented out his space. So, how long does it take to create an entirely new manufacturing line for masks? According to him, at least a month. The device, the manufacturing equipment, took 28 days, according to him. 25 days. 25 days. And he only took a week to get his factory ready, because his factory was already set up for dustless environment. So that was his own advantage, right? And then, so that's how long, well, that gives you an idea of how fast this can ramp up. It takes about a month to get your equipment ready. It takes about a month to get your to build, well, at least a month to build your own dustless environment to put these equipment in. And yeah, so that's how that is, and maybe that's interesting. And so if you do consider building your own mask factory, well, here is some information for you. And this is in China. If you try to build it in US, maybe the environmental people will find you, and it will take a year to permit it. All right, that's all for today. Very long video. And if you haven't enjoyed it, click dislike, and you have, like, subscribe, whatever. And see you next time. Bye.